This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. December 1971, Anchorage, Alaska. A young housewife steps out of a grocery store into the dim Anchorage afternoon. Snow crunches under her boots as she crosses a nearly empty parking lot, arms full of shopping bags. She doesn't notice the man watching her from behind a pickup truck. As she reaches her car, suddenly, a pistol digs into her ribs. "Get in," a low voice hisses. The housewife's heart leaps into her throat. Gunmetal presses against her coat. Trembling, she fumbles with her keys. The stranger shoves her into the driver's seat and slides in behind her. He's wiry, pockmarked, with intense eyes. In the silence, she hears only her own pulse, just barely audible over the man's breathing. He ties her hands. The shopping bags topple, apples rolling across the floorboard. The man's breathing is rapid, excited. With the barrel of the gun under her chin, he growls an unspeakable demand. Tears sting her eyes as she realizes the man's intent. In a flash of terror-fueled adrenaline, she wrenches the door handle and throws herself onto the pavement, screaming. Panicked by her screams and headlights sweeping into the lot, the attacker peels off into the night. The young woman collapses and sobs on the icy ground, alive and free. This woman would later go on to identify her attacker as Robert Hansen. He was arrested and charged with the attempted rape of this housewife in Anchorage in 1971, but prosecutors bargained the charges down. The rape charge was dropped entirely, and Hansen pleaded no contest to a lesser offense of assault with a deadly weapon. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, yet served only 6 months before being put on a work release program and sent to a halfway house. Robert Hansen was effectively caught and then released. Little did anyone know, this catch and release would embolden a predator. Hansen walked free by 1972, and soon began stalking new prey. Over the next decade, women in Anchorage would vanish without a trace, their fates unknown. The justice system's mercy in 1971 had given a budding serial offender a second chance. This is part 2 of The Butcher Baker, Catch and Release. A little past 5 a.m. on June 13th, 1983, Anchorage police cruisers sped toward a seedy motor inn on Gambell Street. Inside room 110 of the Big Timber Motel, officers find a young girl huddled on the bed, barefoot, shivering, and still wearing a pair of handcuffs. Her name is Cindy Paulson, and minutes earlier, she had made a run for her life. Cindy is just 17 years old, a dancer who had been working on the streets to survive. Through terrified sobs, she tells police a nearly unbelievable story, that a potential customer kidnapped her at gunpoint, chained and raped her in his basement, and then tried to load her onto a private plane, possibly to take her into the Alaskan wilderness to hunt her down like an animal. She claims that she escaped only by jumping out of his car and fleeing while he was distracted at the airport. The officers are astonished. Cindy's ordeal sounds like something out of a horror movie, and at first, some are skeptical that such an elaborate cruelty could be real. But Cindy is frantic, begging them to believe her. She can even describe the man's home interior in detail, the layout of the basement rec room where he chained her to a post, the bearskin rug on the floor, the mounted hunting trophies on the walls. She describes her attacker as a short, wiry, middle-aged man, maybe early 40s, with acne-scarred skin and a stutter in his voice. His name, she says, is Robert. He never told her his last name, though. But she remembers where he was taking her. Merrill Field, the small municipal airport. He had a blue and white bush plane waiting there. Cindy claims that she even had the presence of mind to leave behind evidence. During her escape, she intentionally left her blue sneakers on the backseat floor of his car, hoping that police could find them later. Rather than dismiss this teen sex worker as just making up a wild tale, the Anchorage police follow through on her leads. As standard protocol after a sexual assault, they escort Cindy to the hospital for an exam. On the drive, Cindy suddenly points out the window. There's the airfield, Merrill Field, and over there in the lot is the man's plane. The patrol car pulls over as Cindy insists they stop. Sure enough, exactly where she guides them, they find a small blue and white Piper Super Cub airplane, tail number visible on the side. A security guard on duty approaches the officers to ask what's happening. He has just seen a suspicious scene minutes earlier, a man chasing a barefoot, handcuffed girl across the tarmac. The guard even wrote down the license plate of the man's vehicle as it sped away. Now putting two and two together, he hands that plate number over to police. Anchorage P.D. runs the registration on both the plane and the vehicle. Both come back to the same local man, Robert C. Hansen. Moments later, as Cindy is being led into the emergency room, an officer gets confirmation over the radio. Blue Super Cub tail number XYZ, registered to Robert Hansen, Anchorage. Same for the car. That plane belongs to Hansen. Cindy's eyes widen. She was telling the truth, and now they have a name. The responding officers now realize they may have stumbled upon something far bigger than a single rape attempt. As stated by Assistant District Attorney Frank Rothschild later, we had him pretty cold on a kidnapping and rape case, a case which was eerily like what we suspected was happening to all these other women. Unbeknownst to Cindy, police and the DA had been grappling with a string of unsolved murders of young women around Anchorage. Victims who, like Cindy, were either dancers or sex workers. Her report was the first real break in the case. By the end of that day, June 13th, 1983, Anchorage police bring Robert Hansen in for questioning. He's a 44-year-old local baker, married with 2 children, known around town as a soft-spoken family man. Investigators arrive at Hansen's modest ranch-style home on Old Harbor Avenue. The description Cindy provided is chillingly accurate, from the blue-gray paint on the siding to the basement den outfitted with hunting trophies and a chain fixture on a support pole. It all matches what Cindy told them. This corroboration gives police cause to detain Hansen for an interview. Could it be that this unassuming baker is a dangerous predator? In the interrogation room at Anchorage P.D. headquarters, Robert Hansen sits almost mild-mannered, seemingly more nervous than angry. He has a slight build, thinning hair, and a timid demeanor. Detectives note the way he avoids eye contact and the subtle stammer in his speech. Cindy had mentioned that her attacker spoke with a stutter. Hansen certainly doesn't look like anyone's idea of a serial rapist, let alone a serial killer. He's polite, almost ingratiating, as he answers questions in a soft voice. When detectives confront him with Cindy Paulson's account, the abduction at gunpoint, the violent rape and torture, the attempted flight to the wilderness, Hansen's demeanor shifts from anxious to almost affronted. He shakes his head, insisting it's all a lie. Instead, he begins to spin a story that paints him as the victim. Robert Hansen claims that Cindy Paulson is just trying to extort money from him. A false accusation, he says, to punish him for refusing to pay her demands. According to one investigator, when told of Cindy's rape allegations, Hansen said, "You can't rape a prostitute, can you?" That single sentence hangs in the air. It's a shocking display of Hansen's attitude. In his mind, a sex worker's consent or coercion must not even count. He begins attacking Cindy's character, asserting that no jury would ever believe a quote-unquote hooker over an upstanding man like himself. Detectives present the facts. Cindy identified his plane and car. A witness saw him chasing her. She accurately described his home. With this, Hansen grows more agitated but sticks to his story. He claims that he was with friends the previous night, and thus couldn't have assaulted Cindy. In fact, he names 2 of these friends and insists they can vouch for him. Sure enough, when police call these men, both initially back up Hansen's alibi, saying that they hung out with him that night and that he was with them during the hours in question. Hansen also mentions, truthfully, that his wife and children were out of town on vacation, implying that he was lonely but certainly not out kidnapping girls. Throughout the interview, Hansen maintains a calm, almost pathetic demeanor. Detectives can't help noticing that when pressed, he stammers and trips over certain words, just as Cindy had described her abductor's speech pattern. It's a tiny red flag. Still, Hansen's meek persona is disarming. He plays the part of the falsely accused nice guy extraordinarily well, a strategy that had worked for him in the past. After all, this isn't the first time he's been accused of violence against women. His criminal record quietly includes that 1971 assault of a housewife at gunpoint, and even a rape of a sex worker that same year, though both of those incidents resulted in mere slaps on the wrist. But the Anchorage detectives in 1983 may not have immediately dug that far back. Sitting in that interrogation room, they see a man who appears utterly ordinary and insistently claims to be innocent. One of Hansen's friends, one of his supposed alibi witnesses, even shows up at the police station, vouching that Bob was with me all evening. A carefully crafted lie that, for now, holds up under cursory scrutiny. Faced with a lack of physical evidence at that moment, and a suspect who presents as a cooperative, harmless family man, the police find their case weakening. Cindy Paulson, by contrast, is a teenage sex worker with no family in the area, a girl who had been living on the margins of society. It's an unfortunate truth that in 1983, the word of a young woman with Cindy's background often carried less weight with law enforcement than that of a middle-aged male business owner. Robert Hansen knew this and exploited it. He cast Cindy as a vindictive prostitute trying to ruin him, and some officers were inclined to believe him, or at least doubt her. The fact that Hansen was also a well-liked local baker, known to serve free coffee to cops who stopped by, only helped his credibility. It was hard for Anchorage police officers to imagine that Bob the baker, the mild man who baked their morning donuts, could also be a sadistic sexual predator. After hours of questioning, no formal charges are filed. Incredibly, the Anchorage police decide to let Robert Hansen go home. They have Cindy's statement, but Hansen has an alibi and no prior felony convictions that immediately come to their attention. His few past offenses like theft and a short stint for arson were not front of mind. Moreover, the physical evidence, like Cindy's handcuffs, her clothing, or the gun, was all at Hansen's house or on his person, and without a warrant, they could not search his property yet. Investigators were left with what they believed was a classic he-said-she-said quandary, complicated by the biases of the era. And in the end, Hansen's meek, indignantly innocent act coupled with his friend's support convinces the higher-ups that they lack probable cause to hold him on Cindy's allegations alone. One detective notes how Hansen's meek demeanor and humble occupation as a baker, along with an alibi from his friend, persuaded police not to consider him a serious suspect. And so, Robert Hansen walks free that night, just hours after Cindy Paulson had escaped from his chains. For Cindy, it's an unimaginable blow. She had survived a night of torture and found the courage to go to the authorities, only to see her attacker calmly stroll out of the station, not even charged. One can only imagine her level of frustration and fear. Hansen, for his part, must have felt a sick confidence in that moment. Once again, he had been caught and released. But this time, things will be different. Unlike a decade prior in 1971, when Hansen's violence was kind of swept under the rug, Cindy's voice will not be silenced so easily. Unbeknownst to Robert Hansen, some in law enforcement believe Cindy's story and are determined to dig deeper. Among them is an Alaska state trooper named Flothe, who has been hunting an unknown serial killer for months now. Hansen is not off the hook yet. In fact, he's about to become the prime suspect in a far-reaching investigation. We'll be right back after a quick word from the sponsors that support this show. Anchorage in the early 1980s was a frontier boomtown. The construction of the Trans-Alaska oil pipeline in the 70s had flooded the city with transient workers flush with cash, and with them came a vice economy of drugs, strip clubs, and sex work. This was a rough and tumble era, a time and place where a great many people had come to start anew, often leaving families and past lives behind. In such an environment, it was sadly common for drifters to arrive and depart abruptly. If someone went missing, especially a prostitute or a dancer, few noticed. As one observer put it, Anchorage was filled with those without roots or community ties, those whom, if they disappeared, would hardly be missed. This harsh reality created the perfect cover for a predator like Robert Hansen. The women he targeted lived on society's fringes. They were, as Hansen saw them, bad girls, who he thought no one would bother looking for. Indeed, for a while, he was kind of right. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, several young women did vanish from the area surrounding Anchorage with disturbingly little outcry. Many were actually never reported missing, or if they were, the reports got buried in understaffed police files. Law enforcement too was jaded by the transient nature of this population. Detective Maxine Farrell of Anchorage P.D. later admitted that early on, when topless dancers started disappearing, even she struggled to get traction on the cases. She recalled, "We were used to dancers being reported missing only to turn up later." But by 1980, Farrell noticed a new troubling pattern. Dancers and sex workers were vanishing at a much higher rate than before, and not very many of them were turning up again, she recalled. She and others in APD suspected something was very wrong, but proving it was difficult. The transient lifestyles of the victims, their use of stage names, and their general distrust of police meant that solid information was hard to come by. Often, when a woman from the streets went missing, other sex workers assumed she had simply moved on to the next city on their circuit, Seattle, Honolulu, etc. Even the local newspapers lost interest when a few missing women eventually resurfaced alive elsewhere. Those who truly disappeared remained largely invisible, except to the killer who knew exactly what had happened to them. By 1983, though, the facade of coincidence was beginning to crack. The bodies of several young women had been discovered in remote areas just outside of Anchorage, confirming at least some of the missing had met foul play. In July 1980, construction workers found the decomposed remains of a woman buried along Eklutna Road on the outskirts of the city. She was never identified and became tragically known only as Eklutna Annie. Later that same year, in a gravel pit near Seward, the body of another missing woman, 24-year-old Joanna Messina, was found partially devoured by a bear. In September 1982, the shallow grave of 23-year-old Sherry Morrow was uncovered beside the Knik River. She had been an exotic dancer missing for about a year. Sherry had been shot in the back 3 times, and investigators discovered 223 caliber shell casings buried in the dirt near her remains. The shells suggested a Ruger Mini 14 hunting rifle had been used, a firearm favored by some local big-game hunters. When another dancer, 20-year-old Paula Golding, turned up dead in the Knik River area in late 1983, killed in the exact same manner, it erased any doubt. Anchorage had a serial abductor and murderer on the loose. At this point, 4 bodies had been found: Eklutna Annie, Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Paula Golding, all dumped in the wilderness. And there were many other names on the police missing person list, feared to be additional victims of the same killer. It wasn't a coincidence that the victims were all from the same mix of streets and clubs. Tragically, in the eyes of some investigators at the time, these women had been considered less likely to be missed if they had vanished, precisely what their killer had been counting on. Alaska State Trooper Glenn Flothe would later explain of the killer's evolving victim profile. Hansen quickly learned that strippers and prostitutes were harder to track and less likely to be missed. This systemic failure, the skepticism and neglect surrounding missing sex workers, allowed Hansen to operate in the shadows for years. When Cindy Paulson came forward in 1983 with her horrifying tale, she was bucking a cruel trend, speaking up when so many others could not. Yet even then, biases nearly derailed the case. Hansen's dismissive statement that you can't rape a prostitute perfectly encapsulated the ugly mindset that predators like him exploited. He counted on society treating sex workers as unrapeable, as if their profession nullified their victimhood. And for a moment, it almost worked again. The police release of Hansen after Cindy's initial report shows how ingrained those prejudices were. But with that being said, not everyone in law enforcement was willing to write off Cindy Paulson or the other victims. There were investigators who believed that a serial killer was at work and they were determined to try and stop him. But it would take some unusual cooperation between agencies and a new approach to finally break the case open. The same day that Robert Hansen walked free from that interrogation room, a report of the incident and Cindy's detailed statement made its way to the Alaska State Troopers. It landed on the desk of Sergeant Glenn Flothe, one of the troopers actively working the string of unsolved murder cases. When Sergeant Flothe read Cindy Paulson's account, alarms went off in his mind. The method of abduction, the talk of a private plane and a remote cabin, the chaining and the amount of violence, it all fit the emerging pattern of the killer that he had been chasing. Cindy was describing exactly the kind of scenario that might precede those bodies turning up in the wilderness. She was a survivor who had lived to tell the tale, and Flothe realized this could be the guy. Glenn Flothe was a tenacious investigator with the Alaska State Troopers, and by mid-1983 he was deeply involved in the hunt for the unknown serial murderer operating around Anchorage, Seward, and the Mat-Su Valley. In fact, Flothe had been part of a special team investigating the murdered women. By the time of Cindy's escape that summer, he and his colleagues strongly suspected that one perpetrator was responsible for at least 3, and now likely 4, of those bodies found in the wilderness. Each new find added urgency. When Paula Golding's remains were discovered on September 2, 1983 near the Knik River, not far away from where Sherry Morrow had been found, troopers confirmed that both women had been killed with the same high-powered hunting rifle. The .223 shell casings at both scenes were matched by ballistics, essentially proving that one man was hunting these women. Trooper Flothe had pieces of a puzzle: multiple victims, a similar MO, and hints that the killer might be an experienced hunter. But who was he? When Flothe received the Anchorage P.D.'s report on Cindy Paulson's kidnapping, he immediately noticed the parallels. Here was a dancer who had been abducted from 4th Avenue and taken to a remote airfield by a man who talked about a cabin by the Knik River, the very area that these bodies were being found. The suspect's name was given as Robert Hansen, a local baker. Flothe began digging into Hansen's background. It did not take long to uncover the checkered past just beneath his quiet exterior. Hansen, Flothe learned, had prior arrest. There was an arson conviction back in his home state of Iowa, several thefts, and disturbingly those 1971 sexual assault cases in Anchorage, including the attempted rape of a housewife that had been plea bargained away. To Flothe, this was a huge red flag. Hansen had a documented history of violence against women, even if the system had largely wiped it clean. That alone warranted a closer look. Flothe also noted Robert Hansen's lifestyle. Hansen was an avid big-game hunter, known to brag about the record-sized Dall sheep and bears that he stalked. His home was literally full of mounted animal trophies. He owned a Ruger Mini 14 rifle, the very model that used .223 rounds, the same caliber found at the murder scenes. And then there was the matter of Hansen's private plane. The suspect in Cindy's case had a plane, so whoever was killing the women and dumping them in distant wilderness locations could plausibly be using a small bush plane to access those sites. Hansen fit that criteria exactly. He was a licensed pilot who kept a bush plane at Merrill Field. Each new detail that Flothe uncovered tightened the noose around Hansen as the prime suspect. In an investigative report, Flothe later wrote that by the end of the summer of 1983, all evidence pointed to Hansen as the man behind this string of murders. Still, in order to move decisively against a well-liked local citizen, Flothe needed to be sure and to build an airtight case. A gut feeling and circumstantial clues weren't enough. He would need hard evidence, or a credible psychological profile to sway the courts and get a warrant. So Flothe decided to enlist help from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. He provided crime scene details from the known murders, including Annie, Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Paula Golding, as well as information from Cindy Paulson's account to one of the pioneers of criminal profiling, FBI Special Agent John Douglas. If anyone could sketch the portrait of an unknown predator, it was Douglas, the legendary profiler whose work hunting serial killers would later be popularized in the show Mindhunter. Douglas analyzed the data and offered a profile of the likely perpetrator. It was astonishingly specific. The unknown killer, Douglas believed, would be an experienced hunter with low self-esteem and a history of feeling rejected by women. He would likely have a stutter or some speech impediment, and might have some troublesome acne or scars that contributed to a sense of inferiority. Such a man might try to compensate for his insecurities through trophies, both in hunting game and in hunting women. The profile also predicted that the offender would keep souvenirs from his victims, particularly items like jewelry, as a way to relive his conquest. Crucially, given the geography of the crimes, Douglas suspected the killer might have access to a plane or at least be very comfortable in the bush. Many of the dump sites were in areas one could reach only by off-road vehicle, boat, or small aircraft, indicating a perpetrator who was at home in Alaska's wilderness and possibly a pilot. This profile matched Robert Hansen almost perfectly. Hansen was indeed a diminutive, socially awkward man with a lifelong stutter and a pockmarked face from severe acne in his youth. He had a long history of being rejected or ridiculed by women. As a teenager, he had been painfully shy and was often turned down for dates. developing a deep resentment toward attractive women who he felt looked down on him. To cope, he had immersed himself in hunting, becoming an excellent marksman. Now in middle age, he had a respectable veneer, a wife, kids, a successful bakery. But underneath all that, he still simmered with rage and feelings of inadequacy. The profile's mention of trophy keeping rang true with something else Flothe had learned. Years earlier, Hansen had been caught shoplifting a chainsaw from a store and was required to get psychiatric treatment as part of his sentence. The evaluating psychiatrist had noted Hansen's infantile personality and his obsession with getting back at those who wronged him. Someone like that very well might take trophies from victims as a twisted form of getting even with womankind. Armed with the FBI profile and Cindy's testimony, Sergeant Flothe was convinced. He famously remarked that Robert Hansen fit the profile down to the stutter. Now it was time to act, but Flothe and the task force knew that they only had one shot to get this right. If they moved too soon, Hansen could lawyer up or destroy evidence. And if they waited too long, who knew how many more women might fall prey? Hansen, oblivious to the investigation closing in, was still trolling Anchorage's streets at night in search of victims. Police surveillance in those weeks caught him cruising the red light district repeatedly, though he did not strike again while under watch. Investigators needed concrete evidence to tie Robert Hansen to the murders, not just the kidnapping of Cindy Paulson. The simplest way to get that evidence was to obtain a search warrant for Hansen's home, his vehicles, and his plane, and to hope that physical proof of his crimes could be found. More after the break. Over the next few weeks in late summer 1983, the investigation accelerated. Anchorage P.D. and Alaska State Troopers worked together, keeping Robert Hansen under 24-hour surveillance while quietly re-interviewing witnesses and re-examining old case files. Detectives paid a visit to Hansen's two friends, the ones who had provided his alibi for the night of Cindy Paulson's abduction. With mounting pressure and perhaps a dose of guilt, those men began to waver. In truth, they had not been with Hansen the whole night in question. Hansen had approached them after the fact and had spun a story. He claimed that he had a, quote, run-in with a hooker, unquote, who was trying to shake him down for money, and he begged his friends to say they had been hanging out together so he would not get in trouble with his wife. Wanting to help their buddy Bob avoid domestic strife, the friends had agreed to lie. But now faced with state troopers who made it clear that this was a serious criminal investigation, not just a marital spat, the friends confessed to the cover-up. They admitted that Robert Hansen was not with them during the time that Cindy was attacked, so the false alibi collapsed. Investigators now had another piece of probable cause. Hansen had attempted to obstruct the investigation by getting his friends to lie. This showed consciousness of guilt. Why would an innocent man need an alibi fabricated after the fact? Additionally, officers began taking a closer eye at Hansen's firearms. As an award-winning hunter, Hansen owned a sizable collection of guns. Particularly interesting was whether he owned a weapon chambered in .223 caliber. While Alaska did not require registration of hunting rifles, the task force located records from a few local gun shops and hunting clubs. Indeed, Hansen was known to use a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle, a common and powerful small caliber rifle favored by many hunters for its accuracy. It does fire .223 rounds, the same type extracted from Sherry Morrow's body and found near the Knik River graves. It was not definitive proof, yet it was another point of connection. If they could find that rifle in Hansen's possession and match it via ballistics to the crime scene casings, the case would be closed. Investigators also gathered statements from anyone who had crossed paths with Hansen and the victims. One of Hansen's hunting buddies mentioned something eerily telling. He and Hansen would occasionally take trips by boat or in Hansen's Piper Super Cub to go hunting near the Knik River and in the Eklutna area north of Anchorage. Those were the exact areas where bodies had been found. This friend likely had no idea of Hansen's dark hobby, but his statement unintentionally put Hansen at the murder scenes. This was unexpected gold for Flothe and the team. More circumstantial evidence that Hansen was intimately familiar with the dumping grounds. By mid-October 1983, the puzzle pieces were finally in place. Cindy Paulson's first-hand victim testimony, Robert Hansen's criminal past and suspicious behavior, the matching FBI profile, the broken alibi, the gun link, and now the geographic link to the body sites. Alaska State Troopers and APD detectives compiled all of this into a detailed affidavit for a search warrant. The Anchorage District Attorney's Office, led by Frank Rothschild and Assistant DA Vic Frum, were on board and helped present the case to a judge. The moment of truth came on October 26, 1983, when a judge reviewed the evidence and signed off on several search warrants. They finally had the green light to search Robert Hansen's property, top to bottom. Early morning, October 27th, 1983. It's still dark in Anchorage's late autumn. A team of troopers and APD officers quietly mobilize, planning simultaneous moves. One team will arrest Robert Hansen, while others execute searches of his house, his bakery, his cars, and his airplane. The element of surprise is key. They don't want Hansen to have even a second to destroy evidence or arm himself. Hansen by now likely suspects that he's under scrutiny. He's noticed unmarked cars trailing him at times, but he does not know about the warrant, and he certainly doesn't expect what's coming this morning. At Hansen's bakery, the morning bread baking is well underway. The smell of dough and cinnamon rolls wafts onto the street as a few early patrons trickle in for coffee. Suddenly, police quietly enter through the back. Trooper Glenn Flothe and a couple of APD detectives approach Robert Hansen, who is clad in a flour-dusted apron, pulling trays from the oven. Before the baker can even register shock, Flothe produces the warrant and an officer steps forward with handcuffs. "Robert Hansen," Flothe announces, "you're under arrest." Hansen's shoulders slump. He offers no resistance. In fact, he cooperates calmly and even smiles weakly at his bewildered employees, assuring them that it must be a mistake. It's as if he's still in meek Bob the Baker mode. Customers sipping coffee watch in confusion as this unassuming man is led out in handcuffs, flanked by multiple officers. Hansen is placed in a squad car, headed for the station once again, but this time, he's not going to be released. Meanwhile, at 7223 Old Harbor Avenue in East Anchorage, another team of officers converges on Hansen's family home. Hansen's wife, Darla, and their 2 children are caught completely off guard as police politely but firmly enter with a search warrant. The warrant is for evidence connecting Robert Hansen to multiple abductions and murders. When she learns this, Darla Hansen's face goes pale. For years, she had known her husband to disappear on occasional hunting trips, sometimes coming home late from the bakery. But murder? She and the kids are escorted to a sitting area, while investigators begin a systematic top-to-bottom search of their home. It's an awkward and tense scene. Uniformed officers methodically ransacking a neat suburban home as a family looks on in horrified disbelief. Detectives head straight for the basement rec room that Cindy Paulson had once described. There it is, a windowless den with wood-paneled walls, a pole in the center supporting the ceiling. Cindy had said Hansen chained her by the neck to that pole. And indeed, they find scratch marks on the pole and some kind of bolt or hook installed nearby. The room is just as Cindy Paulson depicted. There's an old brown couch, a pool table, a bearskin rug on the floor. Hunting trophies, deer heads, and a prized Dall sheep stare glassy-eyed from the walls. It's an eerie feeling for the officers. Cindy's nightmare is no longer abstract. It feels real. They can almost picture the terrified teenager chained there for hours on end. One investigator notes that the basement was exactly as Cindy had described it, down to the hidden alcove that's been soundproofed. That alone gives them confidence. Cindy never set foot in this house after that night, so how else could she know? This corroboration emboldens the case that Hansen did abduct her, but the team needs physical evidence linking Hansen to the murders, and for that, they'll have to search everywhere. Officers scatter throughout the house, the kitchen, bedrooms, garage. Officers carefully bag any suspicious items: ropes, chains, firearms catalogs, floor mats from Hansen's car, in case they hold fibers or hairs. For a while, they come up empty on any smoking gun. Hansen's wife observes anxiously as they rifle through drawers and closets, apologizing softly each time they disrupt her neatly folded linens. It seems like a fruitless hunt, until one investigator decides to take a closer look at the master bedroom. Against one wall stands a large king-size bed. The detective runs his hands along the headboard. It feels unusually thick. Remembering that the warrant covers any personal records, journals, maps, etc., he wonders if something could be hidden inside. He discovers a small panel or a false back in the headboard that comes off. Behind it, stuffed into the void of the headboard's cavity, is an aviation map. Unfolding it on the bed, the officer feels a jolt of adrenaline. The map is of the Anchorage area and the Matsu Valley, and it's marked with dozens of hand-drawn X's. Each X is placed in remote locations, along rivers, near wooded glens, deep in the wild. There are dozens of them. Quickly, he recognizes a few. One X sits by Eklutna Lake, where Eklutna Annie was found. Another near Seward, where Joanna Messina was discovered. Another on the Knik River just about where Sherry Morrow and Paula Golding were discovered. The X's seem to match up. This officer calls out to his colleagues, heart pounding. In total, they count marks that number in the high 20s, possibly 30 or more. Eventually, authorities will determine that there are 37 X marks on this map, each one believed to denote a victim's burial spot. At that moment, though, they only know it's far more sites than the 4 bodies that they've found so far. To them, this is the motherlode of evidence. A literal killer's scorecard. Carefully, they bag the map to preserve it. The officers exchange glances of grim satisfaction. This alone could be the case breaker. One of them later says, "It was circumstantial, sure, but seeing those X's was like seeing into a murderer's mind." Next, an investigator climbs up into the attic crawlspace above the master bedroom. It's dark and sweltering as he pokes around with a flashlight. At first, he sees nothing but pink insulation and some old boxes. But as he lifts a section of fiberglass insulation, he notices something glinting. Pieces of jewelry are scattered atop a ceiling joist, as if stashed hastily and forgotten. He collects them in evidence bags. They're inexpensive trinkets, things like chains, women's rings, and necklaces. Among them is a pendant in the shape of an arrowhead. This catches one detective's attention immediately. They'd heard from friends of Sherry Morrow that she always wore a pendant necklace with a small arrowhead charm. It was missing when her body was found in 1982, presumably taken by her killer. Now, here it appears to be hidden in Robert Hansen's attic. These are trophies kept from victims, exactly as the FBI profile predicted. One officer holding a handful of dusty jewelry reportedly had a moment of confusion. "I thought, why would Hansen's wife hide her jewelry up here?" he said later, before the realization hit him like a truck. This isn't his wife's jewelry. These are the souvenirs of murder. They begin cataloging every found item. Many will later be identified by families of missing women, confirming their worst fears. Finally, amid an array of firearms piled up in the corner of the attic, searchers find what they've been hoping for: a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 rifle. It's the kind of gun that Robert Hansen would plausibly own for hunting, but it's also very likely the murder weapon used on at least Sherry Morrow, Paula Golding, and who knows how many others. The rifle is seized and sent for immediate ballistics testing. If the bullets and shell casings from the crime scene match this weapon, it will be irrefutable physical evidence tying Robert Hansen to the killings. Later that day, the forensic lab confirms a match. Test firings from Hansen's Ruger have the same markings as the spent .223 shells recovered near the Knik River graves. The probability of that being a coincidence is effectively zero. This is literally their smoking gun. Over at Merrill Field, officers also search Hansen's plane. Inside the small Piper Super Cub that he owned, they find lengths of nylon rope, some duct tape, and an odd, custom-built seat in the back, possibly used to tie down cargo or restrain victims. There's also a rug and blanket in the back of the plane. It's all collected as evidence. Hansen's vehicles are similarly searched. In the car trunk they find a few .223 shell casings and bullet holes, later suspected to be from him sighting in his rifle or potentially from struggles with victims. Bit by bit, every piece seems to fortify the case. By the afternoon of October 27, 1983, news breaks in Anchorage that an arrest has been made in the case of the murdered dancers. The community is stunned as reporters name Robert Hansen, the baker and quiet neighbor, as the suspect. But investigators are not celebrating publicly yet. They still have a lot of work to do. Namely, confronting Hansen with the mountain of evidence, and ideally, getting a confession for all the murders represented by those X's on the map they found. Back at the station, Robert Hansen sits in an interrogation room once more, now as an officially arrested suspect. This time, the tone in the room is entirely different. Gone is the tentative questioning and the polite disbelief that marked his June interview. In its place is the steely certainty of lawmen who know that they have their man. On the table before Hansen, investigators methodically lay out item after damning item. A stack of jewelry bags, the recovered rifle, enlarged photos of the marked map. Hansen's eyes flick over them, but he maintains a meek facade, at least at first. He insists those things prove nothing. He claims the jewelry was acquired innocently. They were found items or gifts, and that plenty of people in the area own a Mini 14. For hours he denies and deflects, clinging to his story. For the moment he's still Bob the Baker, mild and cooperative, playing a chess game with detectives in the hopes of outsmarting them. Frustrated, the head prosecutor on the case, Frank Rothschild, joins in the interrogation. In a calculated move, Rothschild and his fellow DA lay out a grim future for Hansen if he does not start telling the truth. They explain that they have his map of death, and come springtime, when Alaska's frozen ground begins to thaw, they intend to take Hansen in chains to every single marked spot. They will bring cadaver dogs, dig up remains, and for each victim that they find, they will prosecute him again and again, stacking life sentences until he never breathes free air again. Hansen listens, still trying to appear unmoved, but as Rothschild later recounted, a visible transformation comes over Robert Hansen at that moment. His face turns a deep red, a vein pulses at his temple. The polite mask he's been wearing slips. For a split second, pure rage flashes in his eyes and the mild stutter disappears. Hansen's lip curls and he spits out a few snarling words. At least one detective will recall him sneering something like, "Those dirty fucking whores, they deserved it." Or words to that effect. In that instant, everyone in the room sees it. The real Robert Hansen. The predator who was hunting women for sport. Rothschild later stated, "It was like watching Bob the Baker turn into Bob the serial killer right in front of us. The hair on the back of his neck literally stood up." The charade was over. Robert Hansen has been caught, and after denying it, he finally knows it. And so after nearly 12 years of terror and at least 17 murders, the Butcher Baker of Alaska is finally unmasked and in custody. The evidence against him is overwhelming. Trophies of the dead in his attic, ballistic matches to his rifle, a personalized kill map hidden in his bedroom, all of it corroborating the accounts of the few who survived his cruelty. It is a triumph of police work and the courage of a 17-year-old girl who refused to be dismissed. Cindy Paulson's escape set off the chain of events that led here, and the system, despite its stumbles, ultimately came together to end Robert Hansen's lethal game. As Robert Hansen is formally charged and led away to a jail cell, investigators breathe a sigh of relief. There will be no more catch and release for this offender. This time, they caught him for good. But their job isn't over. Now they face the grueling task of accounting for every X on that map, giving names to the unknown victims, and securing justice in court. The saga is far from over, but on this October day in 1983, one thing is certain. The nightmare in Anchorage has finally been brought to an end. But even that doesn't end our story. To be continued on the next episode of Unresolved.